Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our expert panel on the question, what is a citizen? My name is Christopher Sindt, and I'm the provost here at Lewis University, and I'm very pleased to be with you this afternoon. This event is part of a larger effort to bring our faculty and their expertise to bear on society's most pressing questions and challenges. We take seriously our responsibility to inform both students and broader audiences about issues that impact the public good. Today, our subject is on the subject of citizenship. And we have three faculty experts who will approach the topic from political, economic, and cultural perspectives, all the while sharing their expertise and their own experience with a topic that is an undeniable part of every person's life. Quick note about the origin of this panel. In very conscious way, it is a continuation of the panel we did in February related to the question, what is democracy? Which asked questions about access, influence, and the formation of political ideology. Our impetus was to keep the focus here to further elaborate on reflection connected to events on and surrounding January 6th, events that in no small way have asked us to reflect more deeply on understanding our participation in democracy, our access to both rights and responsibilities as citizens, our potential to make a difference as individuals. In preparation, I was reminded of a couple of things. The word democracy has embedded in it its Greek origin, the stem, demos, which means citizen. And that brings us to our focus today. I will quickly introduce and welcome our faculty. They will each present, and then we will have some time at the end for questions and conversation among our panelists. I'll probably say it a few times, but if you do have a question at any time during the presentations, you can type it right away into the Q&A section of the WebEx platform, and we will not take questions until the discussion point at the end, but you can log the questions as they come to you, and we can address them afterwards. And our time today will be about an hour. We will finish around 5 o'clock, and so you can. We plan to have presentations for about 30 minutes or so, and then discussion for the rest of the time we have together. So I'm going to introduce all three of our panelists, and then we'll get started. Dr. Justin Delacour is an assistant professor of political science at Lewis University. He teaches comparative politics and international relations and specializes in Latin American politics and the United States Latin American relations. Dr. Wei Chen is an associate professor of economics. He has published in leading academic journals and served as a referee for many peer-reviewed journals. His research includes the subjects of labor economics, health economics, applied economics, and applied statistics. And Dr. Pramod Mishra is an associate professor and chair of English Studies at Lewis. He teaches post-colonial, non-Western, and African-American literatures at Lewis. He is also a columnist for the Kathmandu Post in English and for occasional pieces in the Kantipur Daily in Nepali. So without further ado, let's get started with Dr. Delacour. Welcome, Justin.
Thank you. Okay, as Dr. Sindt mentioned, I'm a political scientist, and I'm going to approach this question of sort of what is a citizen or what is citizenship from a political scientist perspective, and looking at, why is this question so important? I think right now in American politics, it may be the most important question. And so what is the importance of the question, right? Why do we even address this question, or why is it so vital that we do so now? I would say most political conflict today, at least in the United States, and I'm really only talking about the United States right now, because I think citizenship means different things in different contexts, right? It means different things in a democracy from an authoritarian regime, right? But in our particular system, citizenship is centered around a number of things, and I'll talk a little bit about what those things are. So first of all, we have what we call the rights of citizenship, right? And there's a lot of emphasis upon that, I would say, across the political across the political spectrum. Most people really sort of emphasize the rights of citizenship, right? So voting rights, right, are part of citizenship. individual freedoms, right? The freedom of the press, the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of association. We associate those as rights of citizenship, right? Property rights, right, are also sort of central to our Western conception of citizenship as well, right? The right to own and hold property, to sort of sell property, and without sort of the state taking away your property. So those are sort of a bedrock individual right in Western societies, right? And then social rights are also a right of citizenship, and there's sort of differences. There's a lot of conflict around sort of what social rights do we have as citizens, right? Do we have a right to healthcare or not, right? What are our rights in terms of what things are is the state obligated to guarantee for us, right? A lot of political debate around that issue. We've seen that, in the last, I think in the course of, really my lifetime, and certainly in the last, I'd say 20 years since the beginning of the new millennium, there's a lot of debate about social rights, right? And then I think the other part of citizenship that I think doesn't get emphasized enough in our discussions across the political spectrum is the obligations of citizenship, right? We focus a lot on the rights of citizenship, not on the obligations of citizenship. So I would say sort of the two key obligations of citizenship. One is, taxation, right? In other words, as a citizen of any country and of the United States, you have certain obligations to provide, certain amount of funding to the state so that the state could provide critical services, policing, highway system, schooling, all of these things. And then the other obligation of citizenship, and this is for sort of new citizens, is this obligation of assimilation, right? Of as people sort of immigrate to any country and to the United States, that there are certain obligations to sort of understand the rules of the political system, the norms of the political system, sort of the bedrock values of that society, and to sort of to embrace them, right, to a certain extent. That is another, I think, obligation of citizenship. The left tends to, if it's going to talk about obligations of citizenship, it's going to talk a little bit more about the taxation side. The right, if it's going to talk about the obligations of citizenship, it's going to sort of focus less on taxation and sort of not see that necessarily as much of an obligation for the citizen, and more on the obligation of newcomers to assimilate, right? So notice they have different emphases when it comes to obligations, but I would say for the most part, across the political spectrum, there's a lot of talk about the rights of citizenship and not much discussion of the obligations of citizenship. And that's part of the problem, I think, that we're faced with as a society. So let me get to my next slide. Okay, so the other key thing, I think this is why this question is so important, is that defining citizenship is really key to the construction of national identity, right? And national identity has always been important for societies, right? Developing some kind of national identity and some kind of sort of understanding of what sort of the common political norms are, common understanding of democracy, common understanding of what the rules of the political game are, the rules of the economic game. Those are really key to sort of the ability to cooperate, the ability to communicate. Citizens want to sort of understand kind of what the expectations of them are in their relationships with fellow citizens. And so if you can't develop a common set of norms, then that poses problems for sort of, it can create untenable levels of political polarization if you don't have a shared set of norms, right? So the functioning of democratic institutions depends on shared norms, perspectives, and a shared culture. Common values, right? What should we celebrate, right? As a society, right? And any society. This doesn't just go for the United States. The norms of behavior about what can be said and done, right? In other words, what kinds of, that's coming up a lot right now when we talk about sort of social media and, what kinds of things people can say on social media and what kinds of things they can't, right? That's, there's more of a discussion of that. And that's largely, I think, rooted in the fact that I think we've had some sort of unspoken norms that have increasingly been broken, and we've sort of forgotten what those norms are. And now I think with sort of January 6th happening and everything, then there's sort of increasing discussion of, what are those norms of, what's permissible in terms of incitement or whatever you want to call it, and what's not. And so we might get a chance to discuss some of that. So tolerance and mutual sympathy over partisan passions are, of course, important for a society, a democratic society in particular. In other words, the ability to tolerate sort of perspectives that we might not agree with, the ability to tolerate people, other religions that might not be our own. Those are pretty bedrock principles of a democracy. It's hard to see sort of how citizens can live together if they don't sort of develop some degree of tolerance of each other's of difference, right? In particularly sort of a multi-ethnic, multi-religious society such as our own. And then also, common values are, what it takes to become a member of a community. In other words, what does assimilation entail for those who immigrate to a society, right? And I'm going to get into a little bit of that discussion shortly. I don't want to go over time here, but let me go down. Okay. So, what else is developing national identity important for? And again, this is related to this question, or I mean, intimately related to this question of what is citizenship? What is it to be a citizen? Developing national identity, common norms is key to developing a wide radius of trust within society, right? The ability to cooperate within society and play by a common set of rules is rooted in a shared values and norms, right? The other part of why it is you need a national identity, right, is that if you want to do things like develop a strong safety net that mitigates economic inequality, that addresses social problems, you need sort of society to actually sort of see each other as fellow members of that society, as fellow members of a community. If society is too polarized, then people don't really want to contribute to sort of the development of a social safety net to assist those in need. And then I think national identity is really key to the quality of government, right? This is one of the things sometimes we don't recognize, right? But if you go to societies where there isn't a strong sense of national identity, right? Where people's loyalty is first to their religious group or to their ethnic group, those tend to be the types of societies where you see what we define as corruption to a much greater degree, because what's your obligation to the taxpayer or to the government or to if you don't have sort of some shared sense of national identity? If your first obligation or your first loyalty is to your religious group or your ethnic group, then you really don't think twice necessarily about, or a lot of people don't think twice about stealing money from public coffers, right? Or engaging in corrupt acts against the state, right? And so building national identity is key to sort of developing, when I say a high quality government with a strong bureaucracy that doesn't engage in corruption, right? And so that's all rooted in sort of developing some common conception of what citizenship, what the obligations of citizenship are. Let me talk a little bit about, I want to talk about some of the bright sides, I think, of the United States historically. One of the advantages that we have as a society is that we have something, what we might call creedal identity in the United States. Our national identity is not based on some particular ethnicity, right? It's based on a sort of a common creed, right? A common appreciation for the Constitution, right? In other words, we assimilated huge numbers of immigrants from all throughout the world in the course of our history. And that means that we have certain advantages relative to, say, Europe when it comes to integrating immigrants, right? Europe struggles with this, right? Because let's think about that. Adjectives such as being a German, Dutch, Danish have always had an ethnic connotation to them, right? It's very hard for someone of Turkish descent to sort of be to achieve the status of being a German, right? Because of that association between sort of ethnicity and nationality, right? whereas we don't have that problem. And so the United States in many respects has those advantages of being, the historic advantages of being able to assimilate newcomers, right? So the US has an easier time assimilating newcomers because peoplehood, our nationhood, our nationality has not been defined in ethnic or religious terms. And it's always been more defined on the basis of a common language and a common devotion to democratic government, a common devotion to the Constitution. Now, I would say on the downside, we have an increasing problem in the United States, I think, and a part of our conflict is contemporary conflicts derive from this conflict over identity, right? Increasingly, where when people start to sort of identify being a member of the nation as being associated with a particular religion. In other words, if you have to be Christian to be an American, or if you have to be white to be an American, or if you have to be those, if we begin to sort of redefine sort of nationality and peoplehood in those sorts of ways, then that becomes it becomes a source of polarization and conflict, and it poses real difficulties or real challenges to the ability to assimilate newcomers, right? And so let me see if I'm going to real quickly. I hope my dog doesn't bark too much here in the background, but real quickly, let me just put out a couple things here, some ideas about how do we solve some of these problems that we're faced with as a society when it comes to conflicts over citizenship, right? Now, obviously, we've come to a level of polarization that is dangerous, I think, for American democracy, and that means that we have to kind of step back and understand, well, how can we reach common ground on certain things, right? Between sort of the different sides of the spectrum, right? I think I would start with two things. I would say we need to sort of ask both the right, the political right, and the left to better appreciate the obligations of citizenship, right? That means I think, I don't think the left really should treat the term assimilation as a dirty word. I don't think, and I think it's also particularly problematic for the political right to not understand the obligations of taxation, the obligations of society to basically pool resources to deal with social problems, right? And so I think if we start right there and sort of look at, well, getting back to what are the obligations of citizenship, and both sides sort of recognizing the two sides of sort of the two obligations of citizenship, I think that that could get us a long way. And then dealing with economic insecurity, I think one point is part of the problems I think in American society today, in terms of the divisions of American society, are rooted in increases in economic inequality, increases in economic insecurity, right? We know that sort of the gap between rich and poor has increased, and I think there's a lot of discussion, I think, among political scientists, social scientists, of maybe we need to sort of move back to trying to sort of provide economic security to the citizenry through the social safety net and through the education system, all various different ways, training. I mean, I think there's a lot more than the social safety net, but we really need to emphasize the importance of that. And the reason why you do is because I think one thing that we see is as people become economically insecure tends to be when nativism actually increases, right? And that's true historically too. If you go back to Germany and on the eve of Hitler's rise, a lot of economic insecurity there as well, and resentments over sort of the loss of economic security, right? And so I think dealing with those problems can sort of lessen some of the inter-ethnic animosity that we're seeing in the United States today. Some political scientists like Francis Fukuyama put it out there that maybe we need to be thinking about developing some forms of national service, right, to get back to sort of assuage those who are the concerns of those who don't think that immigrants are assimilating. And I think, by the way, a lot of times that's not fair. I think most immigrants do want to assimilate into American political culture, but in any case, we need to convey, I think, to those who are concerned about the obligations of citizenship, the importance of assimilation, that we take that seriously, right? That we understand the importance of sort of developing a common national identity with a common set of political norms, a common sort of understanding of our political traditions. And then with respect to immigration policy, there's potential compromises that could be struck between sort of the different sides of the political spectrum, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, that could overcome, or at least potentially sort of move us in a direction of some I don't know, I guess the word would be some degree of compromise, some degree of overcoming the polarization that we're faced with today. One possibility is that we could go to a sort of developing a path to citizenship that that the Republicans have been opposed to. In other words, developing a path to citizenship for current immigrants that are not undocumented, that are currently undocumented, in exchange for things like border enforcement, right? That's the other thing we have to think about too, is that sometimes in a democracy it involves compromise, right? And we need to sort of get back to sort of how is it that we can sort of overcome the level of polarization that led to the events that we saw, I think, at the beginning of the year. And so that's pretty much all I have to say. I hope I know I went over time. I think I went 15 minutes, and my apologies, and I'll stop with that.
No problem. Thank you so much, Professor Delacour, for those that really engaging presentation. Reminder to everyone to put questions in the Q&A as we go. Thank you for those of you who have done that. And where that presentation ended, I think, is a great transition to Dr. Chen. So please take it away as we load that up.
Thank you, Chris. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay. So today I'm going to talk about how immigration will affect the United States. I think some people, they have the concern that if we have more immigrants, probably those immigrants will take jobs from Native Americans. They wonder how will immigration affect the United States? So basically today I'm going to answer, will immigration benefit or hurt the United States? I'm going to answer this question from two perspectives. I'm going to talk about how immigration will affect the job market outcomes and how immigration will affect economic growth. We know that right now, if a person wants to become the citizen of the United States, there are three ways. First, through descent. Second, through birth in the territory. The third way is through naturalization. I think this question, will immigration benefit or hurt the United States, is important because if we believe immigration will benefit the United States, of course, we should encourage those non-citizens to become American citizens through naturalization. If we believe that immigration will hurt the United States, of course, we should not support naturalization. So let's see, will immigration benefit or hurt the United States? To answer this question, I'll first divide immigrants into two groups. We have low-skilled immigrants and we have high-skilled immigrants. For Native American workers, of course, we have low-skilled Native workers and high-skilled Native workers. So I'm going to first talk about how low-skilled immigrants will affect low-skilled Native workers. Then I'm going to talk about how low-skilled immigrants will affect high-skilled Native workers. Of course, I'm going to also talk about how high-skilled immigrants will affect both types of Native workers. So first, let me talk about how low-skilled immigrants will affect low-skilled Native workers. I think economists tend to believe that low-skilled immigrants and low-skilled Native workers, they are substitutes. If we believe that the increase in the number of low-skilled immigrants is going to cause the labor supply to increase, one probably can argue that eventually we're going to see a lower nominal wage for all low-skilled workers. But this is only based on the assumption that the demand for goods and services will stay the same and the production capacity will not increase. But we know, generally speaking, that's not true. Because if we have more immigrants, the demand for goods and services will increase. Because those immigrants, after all, they're going to consume goods and services. As a result, we will need to produce more goods and services. We need to produce more goods and services. At the same time, I'm going to say we will be able to produce more goods and services because we have more labor. You can imagine that as the production capacity increases, the demand for labor will also increase. So basically, we have two effects going on. First, labor supply increases at the same time the demand for labor increases. Whether the nominal wage for low-skilled workers will increase or decrease, I think it depends on whether the increase in demand is larger or the increase in supply is larger. If the increase in demand for low-skilled labor is greater than the increase in supply of low-skilled labor, we may actually see an increase in the nominal wage for all low-skilled workers. And also, I want to focus on diversity of goods and services and comparative advantage. If we have more low-skilled immigrants, of course, we'll be able to produce more diversified goods and services. Of course, everybody in the United States will benefit, right? And also, we may want to think about comparative advantage. In economics, we define comparative advantage as the advantage that a person or a country will have if that person or country can produce something at lower opportunity cost. We know that right now the United States is not a labor abundant country, so we don't have a comparative advantage in producing labor intensive goods. You can imagine that if we have more low-skilled immigrants, well, we're gonna become relatively more labor abundant. Eventually, we will be able to cultivate new industries in which we have a comparative advantage in producing labor intensive goods. As we cultivate new industries, we're going to create more jobs, so low-skilled workers will benefit. Also, I want to focus on real wage. Sometimes nominal wage can be misleading. If we have more low-skilled immigrants, it doesn't mean that low-skilled workers definitely are going to be worse off. We need to pay attention to real wage. We know that if we have more low-skilled immigrants, labor cost will be lower, so prices will be lower. If we assume that the nominal wage for low-skilled workers decreases, so we need to compare two effects. I'm going to say if the decrease in the nominal wage is the same as the decrease in the price level, the real wage of low-skilled workers may actually stay the same. It's very possible that the decrease in the overall price level is larger than the decrease in the nominal wage. If that's the case, actually, the real wage of low-skilled workers will increase. So basically, the argument here is that low-skilled immigrants may not necessarily hurt low-skilled native workers. Next, I'm going to talk about how low-skilled immigrants will affect high-skilled native workers. We know, generally speaking, low-skilled immigrants, they do not compete with high-skilled native workers because there is a skill gap. So there is no competition. I talk about variety of goods and services and the possibility that prices will be lower. If we can produce more varieties of goods and services, and if prices are lower, of course, everybody will be better off. Next, let's talk about how high-skilled immigrants will affect low-skilled native workers. I'm going to say high-skilled immigrants do not compete with low-skilled native workers. The reason there is a skill gap, so there is no competition. We know that high-skilled immigrants, they are better educated. They tend to bring knowledge, wealth, technology, and their skills to the United States. As a result, our productivity is going to increase. Eventually, we're going to expand our production, and I'm going to say all workers will benefit from the immigration of high-skilled non-citizen workers. Let me go to the next slide. Next, I'm going to talk about how high-skilled immigrants will affect high-skilled native workers. Economists, they believe that high-skilled immigrants and high-skilled native workers, they are complements. By complements, we mean that high-skilled immigrants and high-skilled native workers, they tend to work with each other, they tend to cooperate with each other, they tend to complement each other's skills. As a result, the productivity of all high-skilled workers will increase. Economists all believe that workers should be paid based on their productivity. You can imagine that if high-skilled workers, no matter they are immigrants or native workers, their productivity is higher, of course, their wage is going to be higher. What I have just talked about so far, just the theoretical conclusions. You may probably wonder, do we have any empirical results that will support the argument that immigration will benefit the United States? So I'm going to talk about a few studies. Perry, 2012, showed that there's no evidence that immigrants actually crowded out employment. Perry also found that immigration has a strong positive association with total factor productivity. So you can see that those two conclusions are pretty much very consistent with the predictions from our theoretical models. Now I'm going to talk about the study done by Hunt and Garcia-Loisel. They found that a 1% increase in immigration college graduates population share will increase patents per capita by 9 to 18%. So you can imagine that if in the United States we have more patents, our productivity is going to increase and our economy is going to grow faster. Also, I want to talk about a study done by Elsinner et al. They found that the diversity of immigrants relates positively to measures of economic prosperity. So I'm going to end my presentation with some empirical results quoted in Bower's paper published by National Bureau of Economic Research, NBER. According to Citi Research, from 1990 to 2014, the US economic growth would have been 15% lower without immigration. And according to ProPublica, for every 1% increase in immigration, GDP, generally speaking, will increase by 1.15%. So that's pretty much my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chen. Next, we will have a presentation from Dr. Mishra, and while that's loading up, I'll say again, thank you for those of you who are asking questions in the Q&A, and keep them coming, and we will get to them at the conclusion of Dr. Mishra's presentation. So welcome, Dr. Mishra. I don't think we can hear you, Pramod. It's
okay. So I was going to say that the issue of citizenship has been really very close to my heart and to my identity, because in several places, at least in 3 countries, I have and my family, my mother particularly, we encountered issues of citizenship for her in India, Nepal, and for me, both these 3 countries with very significant consequences. So personally, personal association led to my curiosity and scholarly interest. Even though I teach literature, but my literary theory and critical theory led me to explore the issues of citizenship, democracy, and their historical roots. So I'm coming at this issue of citizenship from the post-colonial discursive perspective. And these are some of the things I'm going to say in the course of my presentation. So that citizenship, the idea of citizenship has been a historical idea. It's not been a monolithic, it's not been written in stone everywhere, even within a single country like the United States. Gender, race, religion, and other various factors, tribal affiliations, these have over the historical period influenced who becomes a citizen and who becomes an alien or a foreigner. Citizens movement, then I go to more recent events, particularly in Nepal and India. And I try to think through these issues of what is the role of a citizen? Who is a citizen? And also political crowds that are hauled and freighted by political leaders in order to advance their political agendas, narrow or larger. And then, of course, fanatical mobs. By that, I mean religious mobs. Are they also citizens because they have the passport or the voting rights in a particular country? And then the role of writers, artists, and intellectual within any political community, particularly in the non-Western world, where the largest citizenry or the people of any particular community or country, sovereign country, are not literate, quite not aware. And so what's the role of these people who are, we can say, avant-garde in their society? And then colonial and post-colonial play on citizenship, subjects, citizens, and refugees in Africa and in many places. And then I conclude with different kinds of possibilities that can occur within these different frameworks. I wanted to begin with Ernest Hemingway's story, Hills Like White Elephant, because mostly our two colleagues have presented on the United States. I teach this story very often in many scenarios. And there comes a point in the story where the main character, I ask the students the name, what's the name of the main character? And they say there is no name. And so the main character is the protagonist, he's a male figure. He is identified as American. And there is a female character, girl, but also in a couple of places, this female character is named as Jill. So the logical thing in the story should have been Jack and Jill. The male character Jack and the female character Jill, or John and Jill. But that's not the case. And so I ask students, so why do you think the male character is named American and the female character is Jill? And they feel puzzled, obviously they don't have the historical. So I said, when is the story published? And they go back and say, oh, it's written 1927. I said, does that ring any bell with you? That the male character is called American and the female character is Jill. Both of them speak English in their dialogues because the story is mostly dialogue. So then I try to connect the link between the publication of the story in 1927 and when I say, what is the mark of a nationality or citizenship when somebody becomes an American? And people are puzzled. And then I say, okay, say something. And then somebody says, the votes. I said, yes. People can live in the United States, become permanent residents and so forth. But the one thing that they cannot do is to vote in the election, federal election. And that brings the voting rights. And that is citizenship. The hallmark of, essential mark of citizenship is the voting right. And when did women get voting rights in the US? Some people say 1920 and something like that. So 1920. So the point I'm making is that citizenship is a political category that has not been the same for everyone, even within the United States. We know about the African Americans. The 14th Amendment made them citizens, and that amendment still applies. So I want to begin with that, just to problematize the issue of citizenship and membership in a political community of a sovereign state. And then I go to, since we started the gender citizenship, I bring some pictures of Nepal, where the new constitution passed in 2015 by a narrow, by the dominant group, has unequal citizenship for men and women. So, for example, men who marry foreign women, these foreign women can become citizen in 15 years. But there is no such provision for Nepalese women marrying foreigners. So that their rights, the male right and female right, is not the same. So there has been protests, and I have spoken on a couple of occasions. There was a women's march recently, where this woman from a minority community, Maithili speaking community, my first language community, read a poem challenging the roots of patriarchy in many of the Hindu scriptures, where females have less power, less rights, less their unequal position to males in the culture, and therefore in the ideology that made these basically men leaders of political parties to pass this constitution with unequal citizenship rights. And then I go to the partition of India and Pakistan. So when India was under British rule, in what is now Bangladesh and Pakistan and India, these three countries, they were one, and people were the same. Wherever they lived, they lived. But partition by the British, with the emphasis by internal forces, the Muslim League and so forth, created huge uprooting of people, both from what is now Pakistan and what is now India. And Hindus migrated from what is now Pakistan to India. Many Muslims migrated from India to Pakistan. And this uprooting is brought out in a very interesting way in the irony of it. In this story, it's a short story by Saadat Hasan Manto, a very famous Urdu writer, Toba Tek Singh. And in this story, this protagonist, his name is Subhan Singh, is a Sikh. He is a schizophrenic lunatic in a lunatic asylum that the British had built. And so when the partition happens, after a few years, this mayhem, a million people got killed because of riots between Hindus and Muslims, because they had to leave their home places that they had lived for centuries. And so, but then after the partition, both countries decided to exchange their lunatic inmates of the lunatic asylum. So Subhan Singh was one of the asylees, and he said, okay, so you're going to India because you are a Sikh. And he said, what is my village? And his village was Toba Tek Singh. It was in Pakistan. And he says, no, I'm not going to go to India because that's my village is Toba Tek Singh. I don't know any India or Pakistan. So this schizophrenic inmate is brought to the border, as you see on the right, and he just refuses to either go to India or Pakistan, and he just lies down in the no man's land. So this is a kind of an irony of the situation that Saadat Hasan Manto very interestingly brings out. In recent years in India, the issue of citizenship has become very critical and highly contested. India is now ruled, or has been ruled since 2014, by Narendra Modi, by a party which is a Hindu nationalist party. And the Hindu Nationalist Party has enacted or initially put up a bill in the parliament. It's called Citizenship Amendment Bill or Citizenship Amendment Act that actually they passed. There were lots of protests, writers and intellectuals protested. According to this bill, refugees from political asylees from Pakistan or Afghanistan or Bangladesh, who are Hindus, Sikhs, Christians, Parsis, and other religions except Muslims, will be given asylum in India and citizenship, but the Muslims are not mentioned. In other words, they cannot be refugees because their country is already Muslim. And so there's a lot of protest about that. We'll discuss that in the question answer period if there will be time. There is another bill, Citizens National Register of Citizens, that for the first time makes every Indian within the country register for citizenship, show their papers. And many minority groups and intellectuals feel that that would then deprive minorities, particularly Muslims, that the Hindu party, nationalist party targets, render them, deprive them of the citizenship. So there is a lot of protests, and there were lots of writers. For example, there were secular people who got killed because Hindu nationalist parties said that these atheists should be killed, and therefore many of the writers returned their awards that they had won, national awards for literature, to the government. And so the protests have been going on in India about this citizenship bill, and this contestation is still continues even though the government has passed the bill. In Nepal, the debate about citizenship and who is minority, who is a national Nepalese is quite prominent. The Nepali mainstream dominant forces feel that there is lots of migration from India, and therefore there has to be a certain language, certain dress that should be national. And in December, the present government, nationalist government, and its leader, his name is Oli, Prime Minister, he declared an election in violation of the constitutional provisions. And so the citizens movement began, and these are people that I know, and I'm with them in the movement to oppose. And so eventually the Supreme Court overturned his declaration of election, and the parliament was restored. And this movement continues now, and we are thinking of organizing international citizens group of diaspora Nepalese to support from overseas, from the diaspora, the citizens movement. And this citizens movement has brought out a manifesto that has two main points. One is that there should be clean governance, and the second is justice. Justice for people who have been marginalized, who are minorities, and whose position, women, other linguistic groups and ethnic groups, who have not been given the rightful place in the Constitution, and the mainstream national state is dominated by one ethnic group that has only 30% of the population. And so this justice, and the justice also for the environment. So justice and good governance is their main manifesto, and that's what has been developing. Now then I come to Africa, which is a more complicated case, and we don't have enough time. But there is this scholar, Mahmoud Mamdani, who is at Columbia University. He's an Africanist. He has written a number of books, Citizen and Subject, From Citizen to Refugee. He talks about how, for example, the British, the colonial forces in Africa, created what he calls a bifurcated state, in which the colonial state gave civil rights to the settlers, European colonialists, but divided the local ethnic native population into homelands or Bantustans or small tribal groups, and gave much more power to the tribal chiefs and make them kind of autocrats. And he says that as a result of that, this division and this privileging one tribe over another, after Africa became independent from European colonialist powers, there have been civil wars in one country after another. So he has written a number of books. He has written a book on Rwanda. He's written a book on Uganda. He's written a book on Sudan, arguing that the divisions that the colonial forces created and the borders of the state they made created this prime environment for civil war and strife. So the debate, the discourse on citizenship, the scholarship on citizenship, basically goes from this initial state that the citizen becomes a member of a political community of a sovereign state, to recent debates about flexible citizenship in the course of migration that Dr. Chen is talking about, that there should be flexible citizenship, because people migrants from the third world, mostly non-Western world, migrate to the economies of the well-off economies. They migrate only for economic values and rights mostly, and so forth. It should be flexible. Cosmopolitan citizenship, writers like Appiah argues that the citizenship should be evacuated of any cultural or ethnic issues and should be totally civic nationalism. And my feeling is that there should be a global citizenship, a global as well as local, that a person who moves to another country becomes engaged in the local communities, but also does not totally get cut off from the communities that they came from, if that's possible. So there has to be kind of a double dialectical relationship in what we construe as a modern citizen in today's world. In other words, the Westphalian nation state that was created with one language, one religion, one country that Europe adopted, and then the rest of the world adopted from Europe as a result of colonial modernity, has proven inadequate. And therefore, there has to be a new understanding of citizenship that needs to be more flexible, more dynamic, and therefore more conducive to recent migration of people that has been happening all over the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mishra. Really stimulating talks from all three of you. There are all kinds of great questions in the Q&A. We have somewhat limited time, so I'm going to try to combine and summarize some of the questions into one. And I think I'd like to begin where Dr. Mishra just ended, which is there's a few questions in the Q&A that have to do with, that are kind of along the lines of the impact of globalization, international access to media, social media, and the like, and the possibility of a kind of post-border world. And I'm wondering if any of you might want to comment on that possibility. And I might say that that's something we heard a lot about maybe 20 years ago and maybe less now. So is that a dream that could not come true, or is there some possibility? And I think the global idea might be one example of an answer to that, but maybe Professor Chen, do you want to answer first?
Okay, so I'm gonna say, from my understanding, globalization definitely is gonna make this idea of citizenship more vague, because people they're gonna share their ideas with each other, and they're gonna share their cultural opinions, and eventually, just imagine that if the whole world actually becomes a global village, you can just imagine that we share the same culture. If we actually share the same culture, even though we have borders, it's hard to say we actually, have clear-cut definition of citizenship.
Professor Delacour, you have thoughts about this?
So I would say if we see, contemporary developments in the world, rise of nationalism, it's not clear, I think, in the immediate future that states and borders are going away, and that it does seem like there's significant segments of societies that are very much committed to the Westphalian state. That doesn't mean that it's a good thing. It simply means that that I think politically it doesn't seem to be the hopes of sort of that globalization would transcend borders of the early 2000s. I don't see that on the horizon. And so, and the other thing, what I would say is, I think there's more of a middle road. That's, I think, more of a solution to the problem of nativism, which would be moving Europe towards a more creedal identities, right? How do you figure out, how can you integrate people that are, say, non-ethnic Germans and non-ethnic Danish people and maybe not Christian, and how can you, but by basically sort of pushing a particular set of values that immigrants sort of recognize certain values of the societies that they're immigrating to, that I think that's the way to overcome sort of the racism and sort of kind of exclusionary nationalism that we're dealing with right now, not trying to do away with borders, because I think that will just lead to sort of more hyper-nationalist movements that would be even more exclusionary.
Thank you. I'm going to ask another question, and I'll start with you, Dr. Mishra, but if you wanted to comment on that, please feel free. They're sort of connected, but there's several questions in the Q&A that relate to this possible conflict or paradox between national identity as a framework and other sources of identity, whether they be ethnic identity, cultural, religious, even to use the local, a smaller geographic identity, especially when we're talking about very large nations that have constructed identities. When does national identity burst and not be possible when a more localized or specific identity is more powerful?
I think that there is a dialectical relationship between the two, that each nation state that we have inherited has constructed, for the most part, even the United States, as we have seen, its identity along certain values, cultural values, whether it's race, whether it's language, whether it's religion. And then there are local identities, whether they're tribal or ethnic or linguistic, within that bigger umbrella. And it's more or less a universal phenomenon. Even in Europe, that was constructed along after the Westphalian model. In recent years, we have seen, for example, France, Germany, and others, migrants from the Middle East have gone there, and so this identity has been created. So the dialectical relationship is what we need to understand, and there are theorists like in Britain. There is a scholar called Viku Parekh. He has tried to theorize this multicultural idea of multicultural citizenship and identity. But in my understanding, borders will not go away. Nationalist movements certainly have in the past years arisen, but this situation exists parallel to, let's say, people who migrate in the diaspora. They can have citizenship of more than one nation state. Citizenship in the sense, so there are double citizenship provisions that the United States recognizes. But even in India or Nepal or in many other countries have recognized this idea of their diaspora having dual citizenship identity with not exactly the same provision, but they can have members of, so for example, of the United States, but I can also have rights, except for voting rights, of Nepal. So the point is that we cannot just be local. That's why I'm making a distinction between crowds and writers and intellectuals and poets and artists. Crowds, mobs, and citizens. I make these three distinctions because citizens, more and more people need to be citizens, both of local and national concerns and international concerns. So, for example, I, as a person who lives in Joliet, teaches at Romeoville, I cannot keep myself aloof through social media, as you mentioned, Dr. Sindt. As there is what happens in China, which is in my neighborhood, what happens in India, what happens in South Africa, for example. I am inevitably, unavoidably involved in those issues, and I make my voices clear through social media, through my columns, through other writings. And so more and more we find ourselves, even though, as Dr. Delacour has said, that there are pockets in each within each political boundary that remain very local, and lots of things can be done in order to help those people rise from both in consciousness and economic matters. The Hillbilly Elegy, for example, is a book that brings out those issues in the case of the Appalachia, for example, or white nationalism in the United States.
Right. Thank you. Dr. Chen, there's a very specific question, or a question specific to your presentation about the kind of geographic boundaries of the research. So if the question is limited to particular areas, and the question comes from example in Florida, but I can imagine the same question would be appropriate maybe along any border area. Does the math still work in that limited geographic area? In other words, can low scale workers drive down wages for low scale workers in a region or in a particular part of a state near a border?
Thank you for that good question. I'm going to say the empirical results I share today typically are based on national level data or cross country data. I need to consult the literature to see if there are any studies based on state level or county level data. In terms of the example given by that person, Florida, I'm going to say, like I mentioned in my presentation, whether the immigration of low-skilled workers will benefit or hurt native low-skilled American workers or not actually depends on whether the increase in demand is greater or the increase in supply is greater. And if the production capacity increases while the demand for goods and services increases, of course, low-skilled immigrants will benefit low-skilled native workers. But we know to increase the production capacity, that takes time, especially at this point of time during a pandemic. I'm guessing that even though I need to see the actual data from Florida, I'm guessing that right now the production capacity is not large enough, even though we have the capacity to produce more. But at this time, it's not possible. Maybe after we come back to normal, we're going to see more positive effects. And also, I want to mention that everything has a limit. We know that too much of a good thing can be a bad thing, right? I'm guessing that right now what's happening in Florida is that the number of low-skilled immigrants actually exceeds the capacity for the Florida state to digest. So if we can just channel low-skilled labor to other states, maybe we're going to see positive effects. Like I mentioned, I still need to see more data. So that would be my answer, my response.
Great. Thank you so much. And that last thing you said also answered a question I had while you were speaking. So thank you so much. I'm just going to ask one more question, and it really comes back to the very beginning of Dr. Delacour's presentation about rights and responsibilities of citizens. And anybody can answer this. Is there ever an advantage or disadvantage of restricting the rights or responsibilities of citizenship within a nation? And a couple of you gave examples of historical restrictions, but are there any benefits, I think, or if you want to elaborate on the disadvantages of different groups having restricted rights?
That's an interesting question. I mean, certainly the examples that Pramod gave, it's hard to find anything positive about denying voting rights, for example, to African Americans. For much of our history, it was sort of violated basic democratic principles, I think the basic values of our system. And so now, but rights are always limited, right? In other words, there are certain values, like, for example, one of the debates we're having today is like, okay, do your free speech rights give you a right to incite violence, right? I don't, a lot of us don't think that they do, right? That there are limits to our rights, right? That there are, that certain rights, if we are too permissive, right? If we allow sort of certain forms of speech can then now threaten the rights of others. And so I think we have to sort of think about those things critically about, you know, speech rights. But obviously we also want to always be on guard against restrictions on the rights of any citizen, right? Because it can also be an excuse for the state to you know, to stop criticism of itself. And so, yeah, I guess that's what I'd say about that question.
Any other comments?
I would say that restricting the rights of citizens, I mean, we have seen in the case of, let's say, convicts. I mean, people, you know, the people who have served their time in prison. And we have opposed that. So the world is, on the one hand, it's moving, let's say, if we take the example of the past few years, rise of nationalism, right-wing nationalism, basically, that wants to restrict citizenship rights for political reasons in multiple countries. That for us intellectuals, there should be broadening of the rights, bringing more people in the fold. But the question that makes me think is that this shouldn't be balanced. The global means balance of the local and the global. What happened in the 1990s is that the US leadership became totally global and forgot the local. As a result, the balance tilted. And now what has happened is just the opposite. It's becoming more local and then at the expense of the global. And so I think that the rights should be broadened as we move towards towards the future. But this balance always needs to be maintained between the global and the local. Because when the balance tilts, that's when the population gets disadvantaged and the population panics. If the immigrants benefits, the local shouldn't be at the disadvantage. If the local is in advantage, then the immigrants, the global migration shouldn't be at a disadvantage. And so that's what I would say about that.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you all for your incredible presentations. They're so provocative. And I hope everyone, you know, thanks for the great questions that people asked and for being with us through the whole panel discussion. And I hope you continue the conversation with your families and friends, and as you move on into the evening, because there's a lot to think about. And so again, extreme gratitude for our three panelists, and I hope everyone has a wonderful evening, and we'll keep the conversation going. Bye-bye.